In the winter of 1902, one of the most powerful bankers in Cleveland, Ohio, sat across from a woman who was about to change his life. Her name, she told him, was Cassie Chadwick, and she needed his help with a delicate private matter. She was, she confided, the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America, and she was set to inherit a fortune so vast it was almost impossible to calculate. Millions upon millions of dollars tied up for now in a trust, but hers the moment the old man passed. All she needed, she said, was a loan against that inheritance, just to tide her over. The banker said yes, and then another banker said yes, and then another, and another, for years, until Cassie Chadwick had borrowed something between $10 and $20 million in today's money from the most sophisticated financial minds in the country against an inheritance that was never coming, from a father who had never met her. This is the story of the woman who convinced America's bankers that she was a secret Carnegie heiress, and how one carriage ride to a Fifth Avenue mansion built a fraud so enormous it helped trigger a national banking panic. She was born Elizabeth Bigley in Ontario, Canada, in 1857, to a poor family with no money and no connections. And from a very young age, something in her seemed to understand that the world treated confidence as though it were the same thing as truth. At just 20 years old, she tried her first fraud, walking into a local bank and presenting a forged letter claiming she had inherited money from a relative in England. It worked well enough to get her a small line of credit before it fell apart, and she was arrested. A judge, taking pity on someone he assumed was simply a confused young woman, let her off without serious punishment. It was a mistake the world would go on making about Elizabeth Bigley for the next 25 years. Everyone kept assuming she couldn't possibly be as calculating as she was. And that mistake was not an accident. In the world Elizabeth Bigley grew up in, a woman was rarely imagined as the architect of a financial scheme. Fraud, in the popular imagination of the era, was a man's crime. A forger, a swindler, a slick businessman with a scheme. A woman accused of the same thing was far more likely to be seen as foolish or hysterical or led astray by some man behind the scenes. Bigley learned, very early, that this blind spot was not a limitation. It was cover. The very prejudice that underestimated her was the thing that would let her operate, again and again, in plain sight. She adopted new names as easily as other people changed their clothes. She posed at various points as a clairvoyant, a fortune-teller reading the future for paying clients, which taught her something invaluable. People believe what they desperately want to believe, and if you say it with total conviction, they will do the work of convincing themselves. She married. She divorced. She married again. By the time she became Cassie Chadwick, married to a respected Cleveland physician, she had already spent 2 decades perfecting the exact skill that would make her infamous, reading a person's greed and handing it back to them wrapped in a story. Along the way, she had already been arrested more than once, under more than one name, for more than one small fraud. Each time the same pattern held: a short stint in custody, a judge or a family member persuaded she had learned her lesson, a quiet release. By the time she settled into life as Dr. Chadwick's respectable wife in Cleveland, Elizabeth Bigley had effectively vanished, and a new woman had taken her place, one with a physician husband, a fine house, and absolutely no visible history at all. The idea for the con that would make her legendary came to her almost by accident during a trip to New York City in 1902. She needed a favor from her lawyer, a small, strange one. She asked him to drive her by carriage to a mansion on Fifth Avenue, a specific address, the home of Andrew Carnegie himself, the steel magnate who was, at that time, arguably the richest private citizen on earth. She had the carriage stop outside. She went in alone, telling her lawyer she had business to attend to, and asked him to wait. Minutes later, she came back out, carrying a folder of papers, looking flustered, as though she'd just left a conversation she wasn't supposed to have. In reality, Cassie Chadwick had simply walked into Carnegie's home under some pretext, likely posing as an interested party inquiring about a household staff position or a similarly forgettable errand, spoken to virtually no one of consequence, and walked back out. But the lawyer didn't know that. And on the carriage ride back, Cassie let something slip, something she swore he must never repeat. She was, she confessed, Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. That visit had been to see her real father in secret, as she occasionally did. The papers in her hand, promissory notes, she said, worth millions, along with a share of stock in his companies, were gifts from a man who could never publicly acknowledge her, but who quietly ensured she wanted for nothing. She begged the lawyer to keep the secret. Naturally, he told someone, that is precisely how a secret like this is designed to travel, not through a boastful announcement, but through the irresistible temptation of being the one person trusted enough to know it. Notice, too, what Cassie Chadwick did not do. She did not hand her lawyer a forged document that day. She did not name a sum of money. She gave him only a feeling, the unmistakable sense that he had just glimpsed something enormous and forbidden. The details, the notes, the numbers, all of that would come later, drip by drip, to different people, at different times. On that first carriage ride home, all she planted was a single glowing seed. I am not who you think I am. I am something far greater. Everything else grew from that one sentence. And once the rumor was loose in Cleveland, Cassie Chadwick did something brilliant. She did nothing at all. She never claimed publicly to be Carnegie's daughter. She never asked a single banker directly for a loan based on the story. She simply let the rumor circulate through Cleveland society, occasionally producing, in careful private moments, to exactly the right person, a promissory note bearing what appeared to be Andrew Carnegie's own signature, for an amount in the millions. She would flash it, almost as if by accident, and then tuck it away again, as though embarrassed to have shown it. She let banks come to her, and they came running. A local banker named Ira Reynolds was shown a stack of these notes and agreed to hold them in trust for her, for a fee, of course, lending an enormous air of institutional legitimacy to paper that was, in fact, entirely forged. Once one respected banker was seen taking her seriously, it became almost impossible for others to dismiss her. If Reynolds believed it, who were they to doubt it? Bank after bank extended her credit, each one operating on the same quiet, unspoken logic. If she really was Andrew Carnegie's secret heir, refusing her business now, while she still needed discretion, meant losing access to one of the largest inheritances in American history the moment it arrived. Every banker who lent to her believed he alone was being clever, getting in early on a fortune no one else had recognized yet. She never had to ask twice. She barely had to ask at all. The bankers competed with each other for the privilege of lending her money. There is a particular kind of con that works only on people who consider themselves too intelligent to be conned, and this was one of them. Ordinary swindlers target the naive. Cassie Chadwick targeted men who prided themselves on their judgment of character and their nose for a good investment, precisely the men least likely to imagine they could be fooled. Each fresh loan felt, to the banker approving it, less like gullibility and more like shrewdness. He was simply getting in early on Andrew Carnegie's daughter, before his slower competitors caught on. For 6 years, the scheme grew almost without limit. She lived like the heiress she claimed to be. A mansion in Cleveland, carriages, jewels, servants, lavish parties for the city's elite. She borrowed from one bank to make interest payments on loans from another, an ever-expanding pyramid held up by nothing more than a signature that had never actually been written by Andrew Carnegie's hand. And the most astonishing part of the entire story is this. Not one banker, in 6 years, ever simply asked Andrew Carnegie whether any of it was true. It would have taken a single letter, a single telegram. Instead, dozens of sophisticated financial men, managing other people's money, chose to believe an unverified rumor over the terrifyingly easy step of checking. Why? Because the story was simply too good to risk asking the question. If they asked, and it turned out to be true, they had insulted their way out of a fortune. If they didn't ask and simply believed, they got to imagine themselves as the clever one who had spotted the opportunity everyone else had missed. Cassie Chadwick hadn't just deceived them. She had found the one lie so tempting that grown men would rather stay unsure forever than risk learning it wasn't real. It finally ended, as these things so often do, not through detection, but through simple financial gravity. By 1904, Cassie Chadwick owed so much money to so many banks that the interest payments alone had become impossible to sustain. One creditor, a bank in Boston, grew nervous enough to finally do the thing no one else had bothered with. They sent an inquiry to Andrew Carnegie's office, asking him to confirm the promissory notes bearing his signature. Carnegie's response was immediate and devastating. He had never heard of Cassie Chadwick. He had no illegitimate daughter. He had never signed a single one of those notes. The moment that letter arrived, the entire structure collapsed at once. Every bank that held her paper realized in the same instant that it was worthless, and because so many of them had lent so heavily against her fictional fortune, the panic didn't stay contained to Cassie Chadwick. It rippled outward. Several of the banks that had extended her the largest loans were pushed toward collapse themselves, and some historians count her fraud among the contributing sparks of the panic of 1907, a financial crisis that shook the entire American banking system 3 years after her scheme finally caught up with her. One woman, with a carriage ride and a forged signature, had helped shake the foundations of American finance. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. This was not a robbery. No vault was cracked, no gun was drawn, no armed men stormed a bank. A single woman, acting almost entirely alone, using nothing but a story and other people's eagerness to believe it, had managed to destabilize institutions built on marble columns and generations of public trust. The vulnerability she found was not in the bank's locks. It was in their pride. She was arrested in New York in December of 1904 and put on trial the following year, in a case that captivated the entire country. Newspapers couldn't get enough of her. The audacity of it, the sheer scale of the lie, the sight of hardened bankers admitting under oath that they had handed over fortunes on nothing more than a rumor and a signature they'd never verified. Cassie Chadwick was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. She never served most of it. Her health broke down behind bars, and in 1907, the very year the panic she helped ignite was tearing through American banks, she died in prison, alone, and for once telling no story at all. Andrew Carnegie, for his part, reportedly found the whole episode almost amusing. He was said to have remarked that he rather wished he had met the woman who managed to convince half the bankers in Ohio that she was his daughter. He had lost nothing but a little dignity by association. The men who had actually lost fortunes were the ones who had trusted a rumor more than they trusted a single honest question. Cassie Chadwick is remembered today as one of the greatest con artists in American history, and yet she never robbed a single bank at gunpoint, never forged a Carnegie signature that fooled a document examiner for long, and never once directly claimed out loud to be his daughter. Her entire fortune was built from something far cheaper than a forgery. She built it from silence. The silence of men who preferred a beautiful lie to an inconvenient truth, and who paid for that preference with millions of dollars they never got back. That is the trick at the center of this story, and perhaps the most unsettling one on this channel so far. Cassie Chadwick never had to convince anyone of anything. She only had to give them a story they already wanted to be true, and then step back and let their own greed do the rest of the work for her. If you enjoyed this story, you know what this channel is about. The con, the cult, and the collapse. History's greatest deceivers, and the moment it all came crashing down. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.